When a seasoned expedition team climbing Mount Everest encounters a devastating series of events, the team is fractured. Some climbers will never return. Others will survive, but barely, and wish they hadn't. This is the fatal breakdown of the 1996 disaster on Everest. The adventure consultants team heading out on this Everest expedition included team leader Rob Hall and his two professional guides, Mike Groom and Andy Harris. No matter how much experience a climber has, this is Everest. There are endless ways to die. Avalanches, falls, brain swelling, hypothermia, frostbite, even a traffic jam in the death zone. One mistake, one broken rope, and it's over. The team included 8 clients from all walks of life: a journalist, a pathologist, a FedEx executive, and Doug Hansen, a mailman from Washington. Doug had been heartbreakingly close to the summit the year before, forced to turn back just 300 feet from the top. After paying $65,000, it's really hard to turn around and walk away from the dream when it was so close. Rob Hall, who had guided him then, took it personally. He called Doug repeatedly, urging him to try again. This time, he promised, they'd make it. Weeks of preparation and altitude acclimatization led to a single precious weather window, May 10th. The team would make their push for the summit. This year, Rob had even more pressure to deliver. On the team was John Krakauer, an accomplished climber and journalist writing for Outside Magazine. If all went well, it would be the perfect promotion of Rob's guiding company. He checked and double-checked every detail, but nothing could prepare him for the chaos to come. On Thursday, May 9th, the team climbed up to Camp 4 where the death zone begins. The plan was tight. Once they reached Camp 4 at 26,000 feet, they'd have 36 hours to summit and return, with supplemental oxygen stored ahead of time by Sherpas at key points. One of the reasons there are over 200 bodies on the top of Everest is that it looks so close, and climbers often suffer from summit fever. They push with all they have to make it to the top, only to find out that the trip down is completely treacherous, with the least amount of energy and brain power remaining. Yasuko Namba was tiny. She barely weighed more than 90 pounds, and it seemed like a good gust of wind might blow her off the mountain. Despite her small size, she was a force of determination. Over the past 16 years, she had been working to achieve an incredible feat of climbing the 7 summits, the highest mountain peak on each continent. Incredibly, she had already conquered the other 6, and now, in just a few short days, she would be summiting Everest to complete this rare feat. As an executive at FedEx Japan, she knew how to manage a high-stress environment. Yasuko was well aware of the risks she was facing, but had no idea she'd experience terror beyond anything she'd seen on the other 6 continents. The group had been at base camp getting acclimatized to the altitude for a month. The team doctor, Dr. Caroline McKenzie, monitored everyone's health as the weeks went on. She was an expert in high-altitude medicine, a rare and crucial specialty in an environment like this where the margin for error is razor thin. Most of us aren't navigating avalanches or oxygen deprivation, but when you're dealing with your own health issues, finding the right doctor, someone who understands your symptoms, takes your insurance, and actually has availability, can be life-changing. That's where today's sponsor, ZocDoc, comes in. ZocDoc is a completely free website where you can search and compare high-quality, in-network doctors across nearly every specialty: mental health, dental care, dermatology, eye care, you name it. With ZocDoc, you can choose the right in-network doctors for whatever you might need and book appointments with more than 100,000 providers. They also make it super easy, allowing you to filter by who accepts your insurance, how close they are, and their rating from other patients. Once you've found the right doctor, you can view their real-time availability, pick a time that works for you, and book your appointment in just a few clicks. No phone calls, no waiting on hold. Plus, ZocDoc helps you get appointments fast, typically within just 24 to 72 hours of booking, and you can even score same-day appointments. Because let's be honest, most of us don't remember to make that appointment until it's late, then it ends up on tomorrow's to-do list. So if you want to stop putting off appointments and help take your health seriously, go to ZocDoc.com/fatalbreakdown to find and instantly book a top-rated doctor today. Thanks to ZocDoc for sponsoring the channel. And now, back to the mountain. Beck Weathers was familiar with death. As a pathologist, he spent his time investigating it and was well aware of the toll this climb would take on his body. Beck was funny and brash, with a steady stream of one-liners that seemed to always lighten the mood. He settled into his tent at Camp 4 to sleep a little before they started their summit push at midnight. The first 8 hours of climbing were tough, but that was expected. It was below zero at all times, and with winds and snow, it was easily 100 below zero near the summit. Everyone was steadily moving, at different paces, but working their way up to the most challenging climbing ahead. Everyone, that is, but Beck Weathers. He was climbing blind. With the pressure at 27,000 feet, his laser eye surgery from the year before was making his vision completely blurred. Making the delicate walk across a 2-foot ledge up the mountain would be impossible if he couldn't see. Unwilling to give up his dream, Beck promised Rob that if the rising sun didn't improve his vision, he would wait there for him to return, and they could go down together. It was 7:30 a.m., and he sat on the balcony alone, just waiting. The men had no idea that they would never see each other again. It was a punishing 14 hours of climbing for most of the team before they finally made it to the summit. Precious hours were lost waiting for ropes to be fixed, and for a bottleneck of climbers trying to scale the 40-foot sheer face of the Hillary Step. Rob, Andy, and Mike had all summited with John and Yasuko around 2 p.m. There was short-lived joy for Yasuko achieving her goal, because Rob had a nagging sense of defeat since 5 members of his team wouldn't be summiting today. The firm rule on Everest is that if you don't summit by 2 o'clock, you must turn around and go back to camp. It's essential to make the majority of the climb back down while there is still warmth from the sun and oxygen in the tank. The team started down, but Rob stayed at the summit, waiting for Doug Hansen to make his appearance. He radioed to base camp to let them know everyone's status. It was 4:15 when Doug Hansen finally made it to the top with Rob's assistance, and they were way behind schedule. His oxygen tank had run out, and the extra bottles were 300 feet below them at the south summit. Rob knew the challenge that laid ahead, and they were both getting cold. The cold was clearly from the freezing winds, but also from their lack of oxygen. Our internal body temperature is supported by heat produced during cellular respiration. When oxygen is used by the cells to produce energy, a small amount of heat is produced. This constant heat production helps maintain the temperature of the body, but when the oxygen is cut in half, the core temperature of the body rapidly declines. Getting that oxygen at the south summit would be essential to warming them up and giving them a chance to get down off this mountain. Doug was fighting for every step, collapsing and struggling to get back up, and Rob knew that if Doug couldn't walk, he couldn't be saved. Carrying someone down Everest is nearly impossible. You either descend under your own power, or you don't descend at all. Rob was about to face the impossible decision of whether to help someone else or save himself. It was 5 p.m. when Mike and Yasuko came upon Beck sitting on the balcony. He was snow-covered and blind, having sat in the same spot for the last 9 hours. Mike tied a rope around him and guided him down, but a storm was rising fast. Winds reached 100 miles per hour, the strength of a hurricane. Visibility vanished. Temperatures dropped to deadly levels. The team grew to 7 as more stranded climbers joined. These 7 people would suffer an unimaginable fight for the next 12 hours. A dark wall of snow and wind rolled up the mountain, engulfing the climbers in a matter of minutes. They fumbled in the storm for 4 hours. They were now hopelessly lost, blinded by snow, battered by wind, and walking on numb feet just steps from a 7,000-foot drop. Finally, unable to trust the terrain, Mike called for a halt. They huddled together and waited. Half of them were on the verge of death, with no oxygen now, out in the death zone for nearly 24 hours. It was 10 p.m., and they had been battling this storm for more than 4 bone-chilling hours. Just how much longer could it last? Facing this storm up at nearly 29,000 feet, Rob Hall was suffering. He had faced many trials on this mountain over the past 6 seasons, but nothing like this. He was stuck high up in the death zone, with a client who couldn't move, and they were out of oxygen. Rob and Doug had been hunkered down above the Hillary Step for 4 hours of raging storm winds. The gusts of wind were enough to blow someone right off the mountain's edge down a 4,000-foot drop off the face of the narrow ledge. Their rate of breathing increased as they desperately tried to fill their lungs with the thin, cold air. As each minute passed, they became weaker and more disoriented. Exactly what transpired over the next several hours is hard to say. Rob wasn't able to explain what happened to Doug, but his axe was on the ledge near the Hillary step. Andy Harris had reached Rob, and they moved together to get to the oxygen supply at the south summit. Andy was in bad shape by the time he found Rob. Hours earlier, other climbers were saying that he was showing signs of disorientation and exhaustion. Despite his failing health, he made the decision to try to go back up the mountain to help Rob. The two men found a cove at the south summit to tuck into to wait for the storm to pass. Tragically, Andy's mental state, due to dehydration and hypoxia, caused him to start taking off his jacket and oxygen. He was hallucinating and simply walked away from Rob. His jacket, axe, and oxygen were found with Rob later on, but Andy's body was never recovered. Like many others at that altitude, he just walked off the face of the mountain. The storm had finally slowed down after midnight, so Mike Groom was able to determine their location with the stars overhead. They decided to find their way back to camp with those that could walk, then send back help for the others. It was now Saturday, and they had been out on the mountain for over 24 hours. Once they reached camp, they were completely done and collapsed into their tents. One of the guides from another team was given directions of where to find the other half of the group. He made his way out into the dark night at 2 a.m. until he came upon the heap of climbing suits covered in snow. It took a few minutes to determine who could be helped and who was beyond survival. Over the next several hours, the guide made several trips to get 3 of his climbers back to camp, but there were 2 others on the verge of death. Neither could walk and barely had a pulse. If they could not walk or at least partially help, there was no way to save them at this altitude. Beck and Yasuko had been left for dead, just 1,000 feet from Camp 4. By the time the sun was coming up, some of Rob's team were putting together a plan to go out to get Beck and Yasuko. Several Sherpas from Rob's team, and one client, Stuart Hutchinson, who was a doctor, went out to where they were said to be. When he got there, he was stunned. A 3-inch thick piece of ice covered Yasuko's face and her hands were exposed and frozen. He broke away the ice and looked into her eyes. Her pupils were dilated and she had a faint pulse. There would be no way to save Yasuko. They looked at Beck and found that he was no better. His face was frozen to the ground and covered in snow. He too had an exposed hand, frozen solid. The faintest signs of life could be seen, but clearly, he couldn't assist them in this unconscious state, and he was as close to death as the doctor had ever seen. The group sadly headed back to camp to regroup and figure out what was going on with Rob, Doug, and Andy up on the mountain. At 4:45 a.m., Rob radioed to base camp to say that he was at the south summit. When asked about Doug and Andy, he simply stated that they were gone. The storm had slowed down, but he could not walk. The oxygen tanks he had with him were useless, because his mask had iced over and no air could get through. The base camp team urged him to get moving somehow, because he had already spent nearly 24 hours in the death zone and was still very high on the mountain. They patched through a call from his wife to encourage him to hang in there and get going down. A rescue at this elevation was unheard of, and Rob knew that. He hoped that once the sun came up, he would get some warmth to thaw his mask and start moving. Despite the hopelessness of the situation, his lead Sherpa Ang Dorji headed out from Camp 4 to attempt the rescue of his leader. Despite just coming down off a day of summiting, he was trying to go back. The storm was raging again, so after 8 tortuous hours of climbing and struggling against the mountain, Ang had to turn back to save his own life. Even the superhuman Sherpas couldn't conquer the mountain twice in a row against a storm. Back at camp, the mood was somber. It was now understood that Andy and Doug were gone. Beck and Yasuko were dead just 1,000 feet away from the camp, and Rob was stranded somewhere up high. Mike was not ready to take the 5 remaining clients down to the lower camps without Rob. It was 4:30 on Saturday afternoon when a figure stumbled toward the tents at Camp 4. His movements looked like something from a bad zombie movie, including an arm grotesquely frozen up in the air. The men were completely shocked to see Beck Weathers, alive. Beck regained consciousness a few hours before with confusion about where he was. He felt warm and comfortable, then realized he was actually frozen to the ground. His hands were useless in helping him to get up. They were frozen solid and clanked against the rocks on the ground. The freezing started slowly. First, it numbed his fingers and toes like they were plunged into ice water. Then came the burning, a deep, aching fire that pulsed under the skin as his body fought to stay warm. But soon, the pain faded. Not because it was better, but because the nerves have started to die. It's really unfathomable where Beck got the strength to not only get up, with frozen hands and feet, but to move forward in the snow. Each crawl or step was painstakingly slow. He shuffled and fell many times over. Each time he somehow found the will to stand up again. It took him a few hours to move his body the 1,000 feet to camp. He had been exposed up on the peak of Everest for over 40 hours, without supplemental oxygen for most of it. It was thought to be medically impossible to survive, but here he was. By 6 p.m., they had to tell Rob that no one was coming. They knew that if there was any way for Rob to move down from the south summit, he would have done it hours ago. He said that his hands were frozen solid, so he would never make it across the fixed ropes with no grip. They patched Jan through for another devastating call between a pregnant wife and her dying husband. Rob tried to sound positive, but the underlying truth was clear to everyone. Rob said he would stay another night at the south summit, and a rescue could be tried tomorrow after everyone was rested. Rob had already exceeded every known expectation for a climber in that kind of storm exposure. He had been up on the mountain above 28,000 feet for 48 hours, and the human body just had its limits. Base camp tried to contact Rob many times over the next 2 days, but there was never another response. On Monday, a team making their summit push found Andy's equipment tucked under a rock at the south summit, and just next to it, the body of Rob Hall. Beck Weathers suffered an excruciating day at Camp 4. He was given some tea and put into a tent to rest. It was understood that he would be dead before morning, and the Sherpas were quite superstitious about death. The storm that hit on Saturday evening was worse than the storm from the day before. The winds destroyed the tents at the camp and created a deafening roar that lasted the entire night. For Beck, it was nearly a second death sentence. The tent collapsed on him, and the nylon fabric pressed against his face so hard he could not breathe. He was suffocating and dehydrated, alone in his tent. His hands were frozen up in the air, without the ability to grasp or do anything to help himself. He screamed as loud as he could for hours throughout the night. He hadn't seen or heard another person for 12 hours since his return to camp. It wasn't until the last members of Rob Hall's team were packing up and heading down the mountain that John Krakauer looked in an open tent on his way out, that he saw Beck Weathers in hideous condition, but still alive. Beck yelled out to him, "Jesus Christ, what's a guy gotta do to get some help around here?" Always ready with the one-liners, even in his most desperate moments, Beck leaned into humor. John was stunned. This man had survived an unbelievable ordeal and was still kicking. They helped Beck get dressed to move down to Camp 2. Miraculously, he was able to move one leg and then the other, even without feeling in his feet. The rest of the climbers were exhausted, half-blind, and had spent nearly 3 days at 26,000 feet or higher. It was a ragged bunch heading to Camp 2, but there were doctors, food, oxygen, and tents to sleep in. Beck had expert medical care in the excruciating process of thawing his hands slowly, attempting to save as much tissue and bone as possible. There was no possible way for Beck to cross the Khumbu icefall. That would absolutely require the use of his hands, and his were dead. Incredibly, they performed the highest helicopter rescue to get Beck down off that mountain. In a truly miraculous outcome, Beck survived his deadly exposure. He lost both of his hands, his nose, and parts of his feet. Beck's survival and recovery changed who he was as a person, and probably saved his marriage and relationship with his kids. No matter how experienced and well-planned an expedition to Everest might be, the risk of death is ever present. And occasionally, someone escapes the death trap. That is Everest.